Good evening. My name is Matthew Ogden. I'm an editor with LaRouchePack.com. I would like to welcome everybody watching tonight to a live broadcast featuring Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. This is a regular Friday evening broadcast from LaRouche Pack TV. Mr. LaRouche will have opening remarks tonight. We already have several very significant questions that have come in from our viewing audience, which we will take up in the subsequent discussion period. We have Jason Ross and Leandra Bernstein present in the studio today to present those questions. So I welcome you to this webcast tonight. It's a very significant evening, and I'm sure you'll get a sense of exactly how significant it is from what Mr. LaRouche will say now. So without further ado, I'm proud to give you Mr. LaRouche.
Well, you know that it's about time that the Congress officially begins to dysfunction or something. And therefore, we're going to be, after this week, we're going to be bereft of the Congress out there waiting, lurking for us to hear what we have to say and to tell us what they have to say. So now we're in that period, and for many people in the past, it was usually customary for public opinion to believe that there was a hiatus in communication and in policy making between Christmas and New Year's and slightly after that. Well, that was never quite true, but today, under present conditions, that is a more significant fact than it has been usually in past times. So tonight we are celebrating, in a sense, or whatever, the end of the Congress's apparent activity in Washington, and we're going to go to a period until after the president is inaugurated or some foolish thing like that. We're going to get the Congress back functioning again, presumably. But that's all an illusion. That's all on the surface. The actual direction of society in policy making is made by a relatively few of the whole population, shall we say the adult population, or late blooming adolescents or whatever. And therefore, what the truth is that there's always something going on in the top layers of society where the real decisions are shaped. So if you take the upper 10% of the most active people who of political and similar relevance in their work, you'll find that they are generally operating intensely pretty much around the clock, and more so now than ever before, not because things are better, but because they're worse. And so therefore, to understand how politics can be shaped at a time that the average public thinks that the Congress and so forth are out of business for that time, on vacation, quite the contrary is true. They're just assembled differently. Because the fact of the matter, contrary to the belief in popular opinion, that a relatively small part of the total population has any systemic awareness of what the devil is going on in government or in other leading places. And that's the phase we're entering now, where, yes, people will be going home, they will be disappearing, they won't be gathering the way as much as they did before, but they're not gone. There still will be more than ever, a higher rate than ever, of people paying very close attention to what's going on in the world, what's going on inside the United States, in leading circles. They won't be gathering in the same way in the Congress as you're accustomed to them. They won't be actually paying much attention to the newspaper men and things like that, strange creatures of that type. But something is going on. Society functions even when most people are simply babbling and saying things that have very little relevance to the policy making of the nation. The policy making of in the nation is generally gathered around, we could say fairly approximately, not more than 10% of the total active population. So therefore, the fact that the Congress is now going to appear to disappear for a while, for a short period, a few weeks, despite that, you find that right now, more than probably in any period more recently, that while everyone seems to be sleeping, a good portion of the 10% population I referred to are very actively concerned, and probably more so than ever before. And there's good reason for that. Because we're faced, first of all, with a general financial breakdown of the whole system. We're now in the process of entering a hyperinflation beyond anything we've experienced recently in the United States and also in Europe. Whole nations in Europe are breaking apart. Portugal, gone. Not really gone, but it's breaking up. Spain, horrible conditions of a general breakup of the economy of Spain. Italy, about to go through the same kind of thing. Greece, already suffering genocide for its price of membership in the European system. We're faced with wars, new wars. Every time you turn around now, there's an intensity of the increase of war. So this is not Christmas time. Christmas time was canceled this year with a slaughter in the state of Connecticut. That took Christmas out of the equation. So the bad things are happening. The bad things to worry about are happening. And there's a small portion of the total population which really has some insight into what is happening inside the nation. People who are attempting to define what should become the policies of the nation come after the next inauguration, and then the general hoopla that goes with that. So the most important things that may shape the destiny of this nation may be happening while you're on vacation or going to visit the home folks or things like that. Because there's some people who are paying attention to business, real business, and they're worried, they're anxious. People who tend to operate with indifference with respect to what's happening in the course of the society's functioning now are not being so casual about these things. There's very little left of the spirit of routine. There's a deepening anguish, a fear, and people trying to hide their fears from themselves. And that's the time we're in now. So this is not the end of the political year. This is the most intensive part of the political year in a very long time. So look at these things in this manner. What's the nature, for example, of our role of this organization in terms of that, within that upper 10% of the people who tend to pay more attention to these matters than the rest of the population? Many people gossip. They read the press. They gossip about the press. They interpret the press. I think of little less consequence than the press. For example, for the press to tell the truth is a remarkable event. And usually they lie. That's the nature of the American press. The New York Times. I read the New York Times to find out if there's one little article in there that tells the truth of any significance. And it's one of the most prestigious, ostensibly, newspapers in the United States. And what do you get out of reading it? A headache or disgust. So there is a process in the United States of people who are more sensitive to reality than the great majority of the population. The great part of the population is conditioned not to really pay attention to what's true. That's what the kind of decision-making that has to be made at all times. But now, at the time that the Congress is assumedly dispersing, the time that people are looking for vacations, the time they're trying to believe that things aren't important, they're scratching through the newspapers trying to find out what the news is. It's the worst place to go to find news in a newspaper in this kind of period. What you're getting is not news, it's some kind of pablum or some kind of intellectual junk. That's what you get in your newspaper. They're not telling you the truth. Is your newspaper, for example, talking about the 10%, upper 10%, of people who have all grades of income, all grades of official status? They're different. But they have one common thing. They are concerned to try to know what is happening in the United States, in the world, and what they should think of doing about it. It's an upper 10%. It's a fair figure, it's a fair estimate. Most people in the United States, and this has been going on for a very long time. For example, refer to the President Jackson administration. Now, Jackson, at the time he had become president for 2 terms, was mentally not in the best condition. He was essentially a snarling old grouch. That was his function. And he had people who controlled him. And they actually made the policies. He would snarl and grouch around and things like that. But essentially, these guys, who were thieves generally, well, like a spy, one of the leading spies against the United States, ran that administration. He was the top guy. The other guys that ran the administration were also of similar status and inclinations. They were thieves and killers, traitors, and this sort of thing. But something was going on then that was not obvious in the mind of the president himself. They would listen to him and ignore him. They would talk to him and then ignore him. They would pass his orders to him. He couldn't figure out what was going on. One of the greatest and nastiest fools in U.S. history was Andrew Jackson. And just think of all these people in the United States who imagined that Andrew Jackson was something, that he was important, that he was a policymaker, that he was a thinker. A stinker, yes. A thinker, no. He did some military things, and he was largely a little bit on the criminal side. Most of the things he did were pretty shaky, pretty bad. He's a lousy character. But anyway, so we're in that environment. We have the same thing now. We have people who are really of no consequence in terms of morals, in terms of their intellectual outlook, their ideas, and they're the big shots in many cases. But mixed in all this thing, there's a core of people who apparently are varying ranks in society, who have one thing in common. They're paying attention when most people are not. Now, I'm a person who specializes in paying attention. Now, I don't pay as much attention as I used to many years ago because I need a little more rest once in a while. I think there were times when I had got no rest at all. I used to go for days without rest when I was involved in things. But I had to slow down on that a bit. But nonetheless, despite the fact of my aging process, this is still going. There still is a percentile of the population which, whether they're right or wrong, are searching for answers or for suggested answers to the problems of alarm in the state. For example, how many people in the United States are aware of the fact, which is an obvious fact, that this world is on the verge of a threatened thermonuclear war? A thermonuclear war which will be started probably by the United States under Obama. Or it's actually the British and it's Tony Blair. They're the real people who run the operation. Obama does not run the United States. He does not run the euro. He's a stooge for the British Empire. And Tony Blair is his mentor. The Tony Blair who organized the longest war ever fought on the basis of a fraudulent occasion in modern history. And these scums are the people who had run this much of things. But still, there are those of us who know that society is important. And we have to think about it, we have to talk about it, we have to constantly react to it, try to understand what's going on, despite the newspapers, despite the TV programs. We are paying attention. Whether we're right or wrong, we're paying attention, and that's the difference. And therefore now, while Congress will be going into a kind of retreat, and it would seem like the Congress is out of business, it's far from the case. People who care and people who are concerned and have the habit of caring, the habit of concern, whether they're right or wrong, are now becoming much more intensely occupied than they probably have been at most times in their past history, their own lives. And the people who are concerned are more concerned than ever. We get that from our organization, which is operating in the field, operating in various kinds of work, in the Congress, in various institutions, in various locations. We're in it all the time. And if you take the number of people that we represent, that may be small, but you think the number of people that we influence, with whom we interact, and the number of people with whom they interact in turn, you're now beginning to see the light which is all around you to be seen. That there is a process of government, which is implicit government, not necessarily the official government, but the implicit government of the opinion makers and the opinion shakers who are busy all the time. And they represent, in total, probably fairly estimated, about 10% of the population. And I can tell you that since the past several weeks, and the past months as well, there probably has been much more intensive concern among what I referred to as this 10% layer than in a very long time, because they know that people are talking about thermonuclear war. At the top level of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and similar people, and also in other nations, a very similar kind of reaction. They're constantly worried about thermonuclear war. You have general officers and colonels in the U.S. military service and intelligence services who are worried every day about the triggering of a thermonuclear war. A thermonuclear war which within 1 hour and a half can demolish the most of the population of this planet. Not only because of the bombardment, but because of the condition in the atmosphere and throughout the territory as a result of that shot. It takes 2 shots. You take the naval forces with their weapons in the Pacific and elsewhere, other systems of the similar type, and the United States has the greatest war machine ever in terms of thermonuclear weaponry. And other nations are participating in that. China is a nuclear power, thermonuclear power. Russia is a thermonuclear power. India has a thermonuclear capability of significance. Then you have a lot of smaller parts which are being pulled together in a war machine, pulled together to conduct a war. And the people of the 10%, or within the 10%, who are more active, are sensitive to this. They're afraid. What happens then, you have a larger part of the population which lives in a kind of dream world when it comes to these matters. They may have things that are important to them in their daily lives, their daily experience, their family quarrels and all this sort of stuff. But they're not thinking about reality. And what Obama is depending upon, and what the British Queen is depending upon, after all, he works for her, under the direction of Tony Blair. And what's the worrying thing is that we're going to lose everything because the general population is not paying attention to the question of thermonuclear war, which everybody in the top layer of government around the world is concerned about. And it can happen. It can happen all too easily right now. The generals are paying attention, the great generals, the major ones. Many people of other categories and statecraft are concerned with the same question. But the sleeping masses, which are living in their own separate world of unreality, are not paying attention. But some are beginning to pay attention because the inflation rate, the health care threats, these things are beginning to spread the number of people who are increasingly concerned. They have not come to think clearly yet. They're still in the old kinds of ways of thinking and behaving. So we find right now that you would say, well, the Congress is dispersed. It's out there doing something different. But that's not true. That leading circles in business, major business, financial community, other things, are desperately concerned. And since the election, or the actual election victory of Obama, the hatred of Obama is increasing rapidly. And the case of Obama's telling Susan Rice to dump it all, the orders given to her to quit, is typical of this. We're now in that kind of situation. And what's going to happen now is going to require our attention. What's our position in this upper 10% of people who actually shape the way that thinking people of the United States think, what they're concerned about? We get it all the time. Our role in this has been increasing. While the income in the nation is declining, our activity is increasing. If you take the intensity of our discussions with people in various parts of the United States and in the world, because we're influential in a certain specific way throughout the world. We're well known in matters of concern in Spain, in Portugal, in parts of Italy, what just happened in Italy, throughout the Euro system, especially in Greece, in adjoining nations, in Russia, in India, in Iran, in places in Africa controlled by the British. All these people are concerned, but it's a small part which actually focuses on the kinds of decision-making which are required to deal with the leading-edge problems of mankind. And that's what we do. And don't think that our work is not significant. It is significant because we're a minority within a minority within a minority, the third one, which is actually the upper 10% that really discusses the political policies of the United States. And we see that more clearly than others because we're there, we're inside. We're probably more anxious about these things than most people are. We're living in a world of our personal world of anxieties with all the concerns. We have all the concerns, much of the knowledge, and little of the money, and little of the other kinds of resources to deal with these things. So we're probably more concerned about these things than most people. We're involved. We're involved in the issue of thermonuclear war. We're involved in everything that's going on in the Near East. We're involved in everything that's happening in Europe. We're involved in things which are in South America. We're involved in the northern parts of Africa in particular. We're involved in these things every day of the week. And we are a part of the upper 10% of the people who really know what the hell is going on. And our role right now, from this moment on, just because the Congress is no longer gathered together, the importance of that 10% of people who care and talk about it is greater now than it ever has been in a long time.
Well, thank you very much. You are watching a live webcast with the LaRouche Political Action Committee. Mr. LaRouche has finished his opening remarks. We will have a discussion period including very significant questions that have come in from leadership around the world. I would like to begin our question session with Leandra Bernstein, who will come to the podium now.
Thank you, Matt. This first question concerns War and Peace, and I'll try to make it a little bit shorter than the novel. So, as most people know, President Obama this week made the decision that the Syrian opposition coalition would be officially recognized. He made this announcement on December 11th ABC News, saying that the Syrian opposition coalition is now inclusive enough, reflective and representative enough of the Syrian population that we consider them the legitimate representative of the Syrian people in opposition to the Assad regime, and so we will provide them recognition, and obviously with that recognition come the responsibilities on the part of that coalition. Now, he goes on to say that there's a small element of those who oppose the Assad regime which are, in fact, affiliated with al-Qaeda in Iraq, and names specifically the al-Nusra group, which people also know was just blacklisted on the State Department's list of terrorist organizations this week as well. Now, the issue with that, and perhaps you can also address that in your response, the issue of the blacklisting of al-Nusra. But it's becoming a significant problem for example, the Friends of Syria, now meeting in Marrakesh, where al-Nusra, or al-Qaeda in Iraq, adopting a new name, has been the most effective opposition fighting force against Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria. And that comes as a result of their years of fighting the American forces in Iraq. So, that being said, I'd point out initially, or as background rather, that that war in Iraq was our dear friend Tony Blair's concoction, and I say dear friend, not literally. So, so on the issue of war, it's been cited that with the recognition by the United States of the opposition as, in essence, a legitimate government, does this mean that our role in supporting them logistically is going to be enhanced? In which case, would we be going to war in Syria? At the same time, it was just announced by Defense Secretary Leon Panetta that we are now going to deploy 400 American troops into Turkey to man the Patriot missiles that we agreed to deploy into Turkey. So, with that on the table, this in every aspect looks like an absolute march to war. So what in particular is the recognition a veil for a significant U.S. intervention, and how does the Patriot deployment play into that?
Okay. What you're talking about essentially is not something where the United States is going to walk in and take over the situation in Syria. They're not going to do that. They're going to threaten to do that. But what they're doing, despite Susan Rice's retirement, which was a very interesting thing to have happen, she deserved it richly, but she was allowed to escape, which is unfair. We wanted to torture her, politically that is, and she should have been tortured because she lied. But why was Obama induced to dump her, or order her to dump herself, or whatever happened there? It's because he was in a tough situation. If she remained up front as a candidate for the Secretary of State, this was going to force Republicans and others to bring about her indictment, or to take steps which would lead toward her indictment. And Obama was still sticking to that demand. But those around him persuaded him that he might get thrown away if they kept her on board. So she was dumped. Now, what this guy is, Obama, contrary to many people's fears, is not a real human being in the real sense of functioning. He is a stooge for the British Queen, and his controller is, guess who? His crony is Tony Blair. Now, I had some experience with Tony Blair in some years back, and it had to do with the beginning of the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, which is the long one we were referring to. I was on the BBC on a couple of cases, and I was part of the group of the international group of people who were hitting the BBC airwaves on the question of preventing a war in Iraq, a second war in Iraq, with which there was no justified evidence, none whatsoever. But this war in Iraq has destabilized the entire region. Now, who did that? Well, you had two groups. You had the British, and you had the Saudis. Now, when you're talking about Al-Qaeda, right now you are pointing chiefly toward the Saudis. What happened is that there was what happened in 2001, 9/11. 9/11 was done by the British and the Saudis, together with a British-Saudi firm called BAE. The organization and financing of the 9/11 of 2001 was done by the Saudis and the British monarchy. They did it. Now, during that period, what happened is that the Bush administration, young Bush, dumb Bush, but both kind of dumb, but he's also a little bit queer. And what they did was they got a law through, a virtual law through, saying that you cannot investigate these 38 paragraphs which identify the role of the Saudis in running 9/11 of the year 2001. Who did it? We know who did it. There are some people who are not allowed to speak it. We're outsiders of this process, so we can speak it. 9/11 was done by the Saudi government, with chiefly featuring the ambassador to the United States, or ambassador to Saudi Arabia in the United States. He was the key figure in this process inside the United States. The funding, the organization of many of the pilots who were out in this operation of the terror operation, and so forth. This was funded by, ordered from Saudi Arabia, conducted under the authority of the Queen of England, operating through a arms firm called BAE, which is a British arms firm. This is the same operation, the same sources that ran the operation against Libya and the killing there. President Obama was a British stooge with Islamic family ties, who got converted to non-Islamic ties, who became, by some peculiar manner, having been essentially, in his youth, a citizen of that part of Africa. Somehow, mysteriously, he became designated as the presidential candidate and president of the United States. Now, you look at the pattern of his behavior. He was the one who ordered the suppression of the 38 paragraphs indicating the Saudi role in 9/11. That's the reality. We've had this. We've presented it. Leading military and related circles inside the United States are fully familiar with this. They're familiar with the fact also that two presidents of the United States, dumb, stupid George, the little jerk, who was the first one, well, the old one was not much smarter, but actually, and then this is what happened. And this same thing happened in the North Africa operation against Libya. So, and what happened in the case of our diplomats in Benghazi, the same thing. And again, the President of the United States put the lid on it and used this woman as a cat's paw to try to divert attention from reality. Now, this whole process, what has been going on, take the case of the Iraq War, Second Iraq War, in which I was involved with the BBC in opposing this and the special operations that they were setting up for me, among others, in opposing the Second Iraq War, for which there was no legitimate basis. A long war which not only destroyed Iraq, but destroyed much of the peace of the area of that part of Asia. That long war, which destabilized, together with what was going on in Afghanistan, especially the drug operations out of Afghanistan, which are key throughout Europe, these are the conditions which have led to the present situation at this time. Now, Obama is pushing ahead with an attempt to get the people to back down to his intervention, a British intervention, because he actually is a British subject. He's also, I guess, was a former Muslim. That these guys set this thing into motion. And we know it. Now, you think Russia's going to back down and not react to what the president has said? Because if the president of the United States, if the president of that country, or if Russia were to capitulate, that would mean the war would escalate. The push would come against Iran. The push would come against other areas. You would have mass killings throughout much of the world, which is what the British intend. The intended killing of people in the United States is also involved. The Queen of England's policy, the Empress of this affair, has insisted that we must now proceed to reduce the population of the earth from 7 billion people to approximately 1 billion. What you're dealing with is you're dealing with empire. You're dealing, first of all, with the core, which is the British Empire, which it was and remains the enemy of the United States to this day. Every corruption that occurred, every assassination that's occurred of an American president or official of that rank has been the same thing. So what you're coming to is a collision point. Russia may make certain arrangements to adjust to try to deal with this thing with other nations. China's involved. India's involved. What you're looking at is a thermonuclear confrontation. And every step that Obama takes in that direction that he's taken already, is in the direction of pushing over the edge to a thermonuclear war, which within an hour and a half can pulverize much of the population of the entire planet. That's the way you have to look at this thing. Don't look at the issues as presented by the fools and the press. Look at what the implications are. See, people often talk about what decisions have been made. This goes back to the can of the 10%. Most, the 90%, generally believes in this garbage, the rumors, the way things are supposed to work. Those of us who understand things, which is within the 10%, people involved in that 10%, tend to pay other things. They look at what is actually going to happen. The foolish people react to what they believe has happened. They believe that if the President of the United States is that he's pushing for an invasion of Syria, which is what he's talking about, directed by the United States, an invasion of Syria directed by the President of the United States. The countries involved cannot consent to that. They will take some measures of some type. And the military leaders are increasingly disturbed about the threat of a thermonuclear war. That's their business. They know it. So don't try to make any projection on the basis of the assumption of an action by the President of the United States. He's only a stooge, though a very important stooge in terms of his role. But what he decides and what he orders will induce a reaction. The kind of a reaction is not certain. But the nations which he's threatening, including Russia, China, and so forth, which are not small nations, nor are they helpful nations, are not going to cave in to their own destruction by the bluffing of an idiotic, insane president.
Well, to follow up on the 28 pages, the Saudi involvement in 9/11, I'd like to ask you something about HSBC. Now, there was recently a settlement, $1.9 billion settlement that HSBC made, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's really a pittance if you're bringing in at least $10 billion a year illegally. That's just the cost of doing business. This was detailed in a recent Senate report that reads like it should have been written by a district attorney rather than just by the Senate. This is a case for prosecution. I mean, HSBC brought in at least $7 billion from Mexican drug cartels, engaged in $19 billion in illegal transactions with Iran in the course of 1 week, is connected with Saudi Arabia and the financing of terror linked to al-Qaeda. Now, when the discussion of prosecution came up, Larry Brewer had said that were HSBC to be indicted, this would be too dangerous for the financial system. That, it would be basically too big to jail, in other words. It wouldn't be possible to do it. This goes along with the remarks made by the UN's Costa, the drug enforcement official, and Russia's Ivanov, who said that without drugs we would have had the financial system seize up 5 years ago. So I'd like to see what you have to say about the role of HSBC in this, particularly, but the role of the financing aspect of all of this.
Well, it continues against in the same general area we were just discussing. This involves an operation. For example, the money which is involved in this case is essentially fraudulent money. It's not worth anything. Really, it's not worth anything. It has no real value. There is no real redemption. That is, no redemption as far as nations and their welfare is concerned in this involved. The whole thing should be shut down. This firm, by the way, this banking firm, was the opium trading firm in China. That's its legacy. These were the dope pushers of China who went into India to get the dope to stuff down the throats of the Chinese. And this was a project which actually, Bismarck was overthrown in the course of this thing because that was the reason that the war, the first stage of war, broke out in 1893. The World War I actually began in the launching of the ouster of Bismarck from his position. The ouster of Bismarck led to a number of movements which walked right into what became World War I. The first major act, first act was the assassination of the President of France. That was done by them. The next step was in this direction, to just simply set into motion a series of wars which would change the world for that process. The major target, there were many targets. The target was largely Russia, or rather not Russia, but Russia was a victim, but was Germany. And the target had been Bismarck. Bismarck had actually prevented a world war from being launched because he had made an agreement while he was chancellor in Germany. He made an agreement with the Tsar of Russia that they would collaborate together to prevent any extension of a war by Austria in the Balkans. Once that Bismarck was discharged by a British family member who took over as the Chancellor of Russia, or the Prime Minister of Russia, that at that point World War I was on. It went through all these stages. It went through the assassination of the President of the United States, who was part of this thing, which brought in the scumbag as president, and these kinds of things, and led all the way into the Guns of August. And there was a recess at the end of the Guns of August, a recess which was called a peace of Versailles. But it was really just a resting place to start the next World War, which went on and became known as World War II. Now we're in the verge of World War III. The difference is chiefly now that the world is in a bigger mess than it was in then, and that the thermonuclear weapons have replaced the Guns of August. So that any general conflagration on policy against mighty nations like the United States on the one side, and Russia, China, India, and so forth on the other, and you're pushing against both, what you're doing in doing so is you're creating the necessary conditions, preconditions for a thermonuclear global war, which would take about an hour and a half in the age of thermonuclear weapons if the United States was involved. That's what this is all about. The other stuff is distractions.
Well, I don't think we're going to let up off this theme. It's a little bit too important. Now, while you already addressed some of the issues around Susan Rice's resignation, I am going to have to ask you these questions specifically, mostly to gratify the questioners, but also to make things absolutely crystal clear. And it is provocative what you have already said about what would have been revealed had she gone through the nominating process, including things that we're going to be putting out on this website very shortly, things that were known in early spring of this year about the United States' role in the movement of weapons across the border into Syria early on in the conflict, facilitating this with the help of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and who basically paid the shipping and handling on the weapons. That's their role. But then also the fact that at that same time the United States was making, in essence, treaties with members of the United Nations Security Council, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, and regional powers, regional representatives, on the 6-point peace plan of Kofi Annan, on the agreements June 30th in Geneva, which Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently acknowledged were completely nullified by President Obama's recognition of the Syrian opposition. So these treaties have been made, discarded, no big deal about it. But to get to the matter at hand, the questions on Susan Rice, we have an African contact who is absolutely delighted with the demise of Susan Rice, and she gave recognition to LaRouche PAC, to our organization, saying it couldn't have happened without our work. But she asked, did this happen now because we seem to be closer to war in Syria? And I'm sorry, the questioner was a he. He also wanted to know, with Rice now out of the running, What are the implications for an early removal of Obama? And the second question on Susan Rice is from an institutional contact asking, Mr. LaRouche, can you comment on Susan Rice's withdrawal of her name from consideration for Secretary of State? It seems that a very broad coalition of political forces, from yourself to Senator John McCain to some conservative Democrats and some on the left, came together to strongly oppose Rice's nomination. What are the implications of her demise?
Her going out?
Her going out, yes.
Yes, so well. Fine, it was a deal that was forced, and that's fairly significant in its implications in particular. Because the fact that Obama wanted to force her through, and he was persuaded to get her to dump herself, which probably is the best thing she ever did in her life. But in any case, that's the point. But the implications are actually limited except in one state. What you're having is a process of rub. Things are rubbing off. And Obama is under really difficult circumstances. Despite the very fact that what he's doing under direction of the British Queen, and she is the key figure in this, the British Empire is still an empire. And for example, the United States is controlled by the British Empire. I could name you a number of presidents who were British stooges. I could name you a number of assassinations of persons who were not British stooges in order to bring British stooges into the presidency. We too, the case of the Andrew Jackson administration, was a case of a subversion of the United States under British pressure to try to bring the slavery system fully into operation in the southern states and the United States, with the further intention to destroy the United States by creation of the Confederacy. And the first Confederacy was one which was started in Massachusetts. So that the point is, this is where the world is coming to. These are not incidents where an incident in and of itself determines a policy. The incident is simply a part of the granulation of the process. And at some point, major force is forced to either destroy itself and remove itself from the scene, or fight, or find an agreement and conspire. What happened to a famous general of the United States during World War II, when he tried to double-cross the U.S. government and getting the United States involved with the war with Russia, the Soviet Union. And that general died. And the explanation of how he died has never been satisfied. But there is conversation and statements and events that did happen in that force, that you have conditions in certain types of time where you'll find in the middle of a war, you'll get a sub-war, which is to straighten out the forces on one or both major sides in order to stop the war. In this case, that action was done to try to prevent the spread of the war into a larger war. And that was a war against war, with war. And that often happens in that way. The time is going to come where people from among the ranks of the upper 10% are going to have to decide whether they're going to continue to allow the British stooge called Barack Obama to continue to impose his policies upon the United States, despite the fact that he is under orders from Tony Blair and the Queen of England to do exactly what they want him to do. But now people are going to come to the point where they say, rather than have a thermonuclear war which exterminates much of the population of the planet Earth with a term of an hour and a half, are they going to get rid of the bum or bums who insist on having that war? It's not a matter of killing people reprisal. It's a matter of removing an agency which is a great threat to groups of nations who otherwise may have strong differences in their own regimes. We're coming to a point that somebody's going to make a decision to shut this guy up and straighten him out, or dump him by impeachment or something, because if they don't, if he's allowed to run ahead as a British stooge, which is what all he is, then somebody is going to question, why are we putting up with this? Do we want World War III, a thermonuclear war which can take out the greater part of the human race population? Or are we going to do something to maybe change a few things we're doing, maybe to save the human race from utter destruction?
I'd like to ask you a question on culture. And actually a number of questions had come into us via email on economics, but given the events of today in Connecticut, I'd like to ask you to address that. To put things into context to some degree, we have an overall intense degeneration of youth culture as part of an overall degeneration of culture for a variety of reasons. Having no future, obviously, is a very major one of these. You've also pointed to such things as video games and drugs. Now, today, Obama had announced that the federal government will not prosecute against the use of marijuana in Washington State and Colorado, basically saying that if the state law says it's fine, the federal government is going to stay out of it, even though it's against federal law. Basically moving towards a national legalization. Now, you had made an interesting comment at one of your webcasts in years past that to the extent there's some medicinal use in marijuana, maybe you could find out what substance is in it that's actually useful and synthesize that without actually producing the entire plant, which has many non-medicinal uses, which is I think the primary function. Anyway, about what happened today. In Connecticut, as you and I'm sure all the viewers are aware, there was a very mass killing that took place at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut. 20 children were killed, 6 adults, the killer, his mother. Could you help us understand this phenomenon? Why is this happening?
Well, you recall that over a period of time, we've had adolescents in particular who've been involved in terrorist operations. They acquired weapons from family circles and so forth, and went out and killed a lot of people and then killed themselves in general. This has happened. And this has happened recurringly. And it could happen more often. It does happen more often in other countries, the same thing. Well, part of it is orchestrated, and in these cases it was orchestrated. That is, the people who were involved in conducting these kinds of operations, as younger people, adolescents and so forth, actually had intended to do something and were intended also, if necessary, to kill themselves as a assertion of a principle. Now, this is a result of a certain kind of conspiracy, but you have to say which conspiracy is the one that did it. And the conspiracy that did it goes back to 1968. And when this crowd, which became something we fought against, this crowd typified a trend based on drug use in the United States. The same thing spilled over into Germany. There were German cases of the same kind of phenomenon. The front has been calm on that account of recent times. We haven't had much reporting of this sort of thing. This thing in Connecticut is a very shocking effect, and it cannot be overlooked. These are children, in particular, the mass killing of children. But that's consistent with the British policy, isn't it? The killing of children by the British establishment, by dehydration. What's happening under Blair's operation in Liverpool? Systemic killing of people in order to reduce the population. Under the in direction of a Queen of England, who's actually a head of the empire, who has prescribed that the population of the planet must be reduced from 8 billion people to about 2. And she hasn't indicated that's the end of the process. The Green Movement. The Green Movement itself is a death chant. You see it happening in the middle states of the United States, where the water shortage and certain forces have aggravated that problem. And people are dying. Their food is dying. Their cattle are dying. And this is the ugly reality we face. So the time has come that the trends which we have, the trends which involve all this stuff, these trends must be stopped. We must go back to a different kind of society that we once had as our idea, particularly in the United States and civilized nations in Europe and elsewhere. We've got to go back to a human policy, not a death policy. Why would you say the Queen of England wants to reduce the world's population? Are they actually shortages? Well, only the ones that the Queen helped to create. So if she wanted to eliminate the problem, all she had to do was eliminate her own policies. That would have done a great deal to solve the problem. And also it shows a complete disregard for the distinction of the human species, for the very existence of the human species. It shows a quality of bestiality which can be understood very clearly by those of us who study this matter. Like the siege of Troy is a good example of this. You had a bunch of hoodlums on a fake issue which were out to destroy Troy. Why? Because Troy was a citadel of its own kind in the connection between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And this bunch of clowns, very evil clowns, conducted a very famous battle. And the evidence which was collected at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th on this thing showed exactly what had happened, that the evidence is exactly what this account showed. And so this is a result of the oligarchical system. The oligarchical system is that a few people must control everything. And the rest of the human species must be treated as cattle. Let's take the case of black slavery in the United States, which was created partly with the aid of Andrew Jackson. Very much so, who was a traitor to the United States, in fact. And you find that certain parts of the population, which I refer to those who are not in the upper 10%, more specifically, more emphatically, of those who are more active in things. Most people have a weak understanding of their rights as human beings. Despite constitutions, despite all the oaths and so forth they believe in, they don't really believe very strongly in the value of a human being. They may have passions about members of their family, about themselves and so forth, but when society clamors in on them, they become weak. They no longer see their humanity. They don't see that they're committing a crime. They don't see that it's a crime for one child to kill another as part of a cult operation. That what happened in Connecticut is a product of that kind of ideology, which does not place a value on human life as a basis for legal rights, including the right to life. And the right to life has been destroyed. What the biggest factor in that destruction is the Green Movement, something that was put into motion through the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And I was there, one of the few people who was of the appropriate age group to see exactly what happened. I was in the middle of this thing. What happened is the great drug movement of the late 1960s. This was a cult. These people were evil. The whole movement was evil. The 68ers were evil because they did not value human life. And it's not just the flesh and blood of human life, it's everything, you know, because people think of we're only a person. Well, wait a minute, buddy. You die, don't you? And how does the human species function? It functions on the basis of people grow old, they die. In the meantime, they've produced children or played a part in producing children. They've educated children. Some have gone to higher education. They've developed scientific capabilities. And therefore, the power of mankind to cope with the responsibilities means that mankind is not a series of generations as such, but rather the generation is really generation in the literal meaning of it. One generation produces another. And the progress of humanity is that. Each generation must create a better world than the previous one. And it's not just a better world in the sense of comforts and so forth. It's a better world in terms of the mission of the human species. I mean, after all, somewhere along the line in 1 billion years or so to come, this sun is going to be a son of a something. You're not going to want it. It's not going to want you. So sometime at the point, mankind, if mankind is going to continue to exist, is going to junk all the greenies and said, go talk to the sun about this thing if you don't like it. Huh? Because mankind can exist. And mankind is the only species that can enjoy this kind of existence. Because only mankind is actually creative. Only mankind can develop technologies and orders of magnitude of progress, which no other living species has ever been known to do. Mankind's destiny right now is typified by what's going on Mars. Not because it's going to happen on Mars, but because mankind's control of the Martian situation is an essential part of providing the means for the continued existence of the human species. It's a point of view which goes back to the earliest manifestation of a creature called mankind, which has creativity, as opposed to the animal species which do not have actual creativity. And therefore the existence of mankind depends upon mankind reaching a point that sometimes they can say bye-bye to the sun because they've got a new place of residence to go, because they have developed mankind to be able to do that. The idea of immortality is not the immortality of the individual. Human immortality is the succession of development of the human species to higher and higher levels, that you should be the grandfather of your grandson and of those who come after that. And the idea of progress. You notice, for example, every species that lives in Earth, in the Earth environment, they live only to the degree that they develop. If they don't develop, they die. Or they may die of conditions of that type. But the human species is the only one that has the voluntary capability to make discoveries of principles, such as physical scientific principles, by which one generation can do what the preceding generation could not have done. And therefore the principle of humanity is our obligation to the development of the human species in its peculiar capabilities. And that if for the outcome of the human existence within the solar system, it were to be ensured, it would have to be ensured along that route. So our job is to take over Mars. We're not going to go there because you aren't going to like that place at all. Until we get, for example, thermonuclear fusion, taking you from the moon to Mars and back, you're not going to be able to do much up there on Mars. But if we continue in the direction of development, using thermonuclear power and even higher forms for the right purpose, the generations that exist today can be the basis for the development of the conditions of survival of humanity and its improvement over generations to come. When we have to understand and define ourselves as what is a human being, What is the mission of being a human being? What should you like about being a human being? And that's what's at stake here. And this thing in Connecticut shows you this is the anti-everything, anti to everything decent. And it's been bred by this nation. It's been bred similarly by other nations. And the key to this thing is the greenie policy. It's the green policy, which is the death policy. Green is the color of death, except in Ireland.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn. That brings a conclusion to our broadcast tonight. I'd also like to thank Leandra and Jason for joining us. And thank you for watching. This is a regular broadcast every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, so please be sure to tune in again next week. Thank you. Good night.